If you don't like my lecture, Ms. Nirvana, there's the door. But if you stay, I suggest you stop looking at my blueprints like they're a personal insult. Professor Minho Kwan's voice was like a scalpel, precise, cold, and capable of cutting through the thickest tension in the lecture hall. He stood at the front of the room, the sleeves of his charcoal dress shirt rolled up to his elbows, revealing the sharp lines of his forearms as he gripped the edge of the podium. He was the Ice King of the architecture department, a man whose designs were legendary and whose heart was rumored to be made of reinforced concrete. I leaned back in my chair, my pen spinning between my fingers, refusing to blink. The 100 other students in the hall were dead silent, their gazes darting between the man who could end their careers and the girl who was crazy enough to challenge him. Your theory on vertical urbanism is mathematically sound, Professor, I said, my voice projecting with a confidence I only half felt. But it's soulless. It treats people like data points in a grid. You've built a perfect cage, but nobody wants to live in a monument to your ego. The air in the room didn't just chill, it froze. Minho slowly adjusted his silver-rimmed glasses, his dark, obsidian eyes narrowing as they swept over me. He didn't look angry. He looked awakened. It was a terrifying expression on a man who usually treated the world with bored indifference. A monument to my ego? He stepped away from the podium, his long strides eating up the distance until he was standing directly over my desk. The scent of sandalwood and expensive ink hit me like a physical blow. He leaned down, his face inches from mine, his voice dropping to a low, private rumble that didn't reach the back of the room. You have a lot of opinions for someone whose own drafts lack a single foundation, Nirvana. I'm working on the foundation, I whispered, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. Then work harder, he rasped, his gaze dropping to my lips for a fraction of a second. A flicker of heat so intense it felt like a brand. My office, 7 o'clock tonight. Bring your drafts. We'll see if there's anything behind that defiance besides a pretty face and a loud mouth. The university was a ghost of its daytime self by 7 o'clock. The corridors were lined with long, stretching shadows, but the light under Professor Kwan's door burned like a beacon. I didn't knock. I simply pushed the door open, my portfolio clutched to my chest like a shield. Minho was behind his desk, the glow of a single architect's lamp carving the sharp, handsome planes of his face into high relief. He had discarded his tie, and the top 2 buttons of his shirt were undone, offering a glimpse of the collarbone I'd been daydreaming about since the first week of the semester. You're late, Nirvana, he said without looking up from a set of blueprints. 5 minutes is the difference between a building standing and a catastrophe. I was busy adding some soul to my drafts, I countered, sliding my portfolio onto the mahogany surface. I figured you wouldn't recognize the concept without a few extra hours of work. He finally looked at me, his gaze slow and deliberate as it traveled from my boots to the defiant set of my jaw. He stood up, and the sheer height of him made the room feel suddenly, dangerously small. He didn't stay behind the desk. He walked around it, leaning against the edge right next to my hand. Show me, he commanded. I opened the folder, my fingers trembling slightly as I pointed out the communal spaces I'd integrated into the high-rise design. As I spoke, I became aware of his proximity, the heat radiating from his body, the way he leaned in to see the fine lines, his shoulder brushing mine. The structural load here is too heavy for these materials, he murmured, his breath fanning against my ear. He reached over, his hand covering mine on the paper, to guide my finger toward a specific pillar. His skin was warm, his grip firm and possessive. I stopped breathing. The air in the office was thick with the scent of paper and his intoxicating masculine musk. "I can fix the load," I whispered, my voice failing me. "Can you?" Minho turned his head, his face so close that our noses nearly brushed. The icy professor was gone, replaced by a man whose eyes were dark with a hunger that had nothing to do with architecture. "You talk a lot about life and passion, Nirvana, but you're shaking. Is it fear? Or are you finally realizing that you've pushed me exactly where you wanted me?" The university library at midnight was a labyrinth of silence, a sanctuary for the obsessed and the lonely. I retreated to the restricted archives in the basement, a place where the air smelled of centuries-old parchment and secrets. I needed to find the original blueprints for the Soul Heritage Project, something to prove my theory right and silence the hum of Minho's touch that still lingered on my skin. I found the drawer I needed, but as I pulled the heavy metal handle, a shadow moved at the end of the aisle. "The 1924 blueprints are in the third cabinet, not the second," a voice rasped from the darkness. I jumped, my heart leaping into my throat. Minho emerged from behind a stack of oversized folios, his glasses perched on the bridge of his nose, his hair uncharacteristically disheveled. He looked less like a titan of industry and more like a man haunted by his own mind. "What are you doing here, Professor?" I asked, trying to steady my breath. "I thought you lived in your penthouse, not between the bookshelves." "I couldn't sleep," he said, stepping into the dim pool of light cast by my desk lamp. I kept seeing a certain student's flawed designs behind my eyelids. Or perhaps it was her mouth. It's hard to tell the difference when both are so disruptive. He reached past me to open the correct drawer, his chest pressing momentarily against my back. The contact was brief, but it sent a jolt of pure electricity through me. He pulled out a yellowed vellum sheet and spread it across the table, leaning over it. "Look at this," he whispered, his voice losing its edge, replaced by a raw academic passion. The way the architect used light to bridge the gap between the stone and the sky. It wasn't about data, Nirvana. It was about longing. I looked, but not at the map. I looked at the way the light caught the gold flecks in his eyes, the way his long, elegant fingers traced the ink. "Is that what you're doing, Minho? Bridging the gap?" He went still. The silence of the library pressed in around us, intimate and suffocating. He turned his head, his gaze dropping to my lips with a heavy, visible ache. "I am trying to maintain a foundation that you are determined to shatter," he murmured. "And if you keep looking at me like that, I am going to forget that I am your teacher and remember that I am a man who hasn't felt a longing this dangerous in a decade." The sky over the campus didn't just break, it shattered. By the time I reached the heavy oak doors of the library, the world was a blurred curtain of gray and silver. I took one step into the deluge and was instantly soaked, my thin sweater clinging to my skin like a second, cold layer of grief. "Nirvana, stop!" The command was followed by the heavy thud of footsteps. A hand caught my elbow, spinning me back toward the shelter of the stone archway. Minho was there, his umbrella forgotten in his office, his white shirt already becoming translucent against the broad, hard lines of his chest. He looked furious, but his eyes were wide with a frantic sort of concern that made my chest ache. "It's just rain, Professor," I said, my teeth beginning to chatter. "I'm not made of glass." "No," he rasped, his hand sliding from my elbow to my shoulder, pulling me deeper into the shadows of the alcove where the wind couldn't reach us. "You're made of fire and stubbornness, and you have no sense of self-preservation." He began to strip off his heavy wool blazer, draped it over my shivering shoulders before I could protest. It was warm from his body, smelling of his signature sandalwood and the ozone of the storm. The weight of it felt like a confession. He didn't pull away once the jacket was settled. Instead, he stayed close, his hands resting on the lapels, trapping me against the cold stone wall. We stood there in the narrow space, the roar of the rain creating a private world just for the two of us. I looked up at him, watching a stray droplet of water travel down the sharp line of his jaw and settle in the hollow of his throat. He looked raw, stripped of the academic pretension that usually acted as his armor. "Why are you doing this?" I whispered, the sound barely audible over the thunder. "You're supposed to be the man who doesn't care." "I was that man," he admitted, his thumb grazing the line of my collarbone where the wet fabric had shifted. "Until you walked into my hall and told me my life's work was empty. I've spent years building walls, Nirvana, and in 3 weeks, you've managed to find every structural weakness I have." He leaned in, his forehead coming to rest against mine. His breath was warm, a stark contrast to the freezing rain. "I should let you walk home. I should let the rain wash the thought of you out of my head. But I can't." The penthouse was a cathedral of glass and steel, suspended high above the flickering lights of Seoul. It was exactly as I imagined Minho's private world to be: minimalist, monochromatic, and terrifyingly perfect. But tonight, the perfection was marred by the remnants of the storm. I stood in the center of his living room, wrapped in a plush robe he'd handed me, while my clothes tumbled in his dryer. "The project deadline hasn't moved just because the weather turned," Minho said, though his voice lacked its usual icy bite. He was standing by a sprawling drafting table, a glass of amber whiskey in one hand and a charcoal pencil in the other. He had changed into a soft black sweater that made him look approachable, a realization that felt more dangerous than his anger. I walked over to the table, the silk of the robe whispering against my legs. We were supposed to be fixing the structural load of my museum design, but as I leaned over the blueprints, I couldn't focus on the lines. I could only focus on the way his hand moved, steady, rhythmic, and devastatingly graceful. "The tension here," he murmured, pointing to a cantilevered wing of the building. "It's too much. If you don't reinforce the core, the whole thing will buckle under its own weight." "Maybe it's okay for things to buckle sometimes," I said, my voice dropping an octave. I reached out, my fingers catching his wrist to stop the pencil. "Maybe the pressure is the point." Minho went completely still. The only sound was the low hum of the rain against the floor-to-ceiling windows. He slowly set the pencil down and turned to face me, his eyes dark with a hunger that made the air in the room vanish. "You have no idea what you're asking for, Nirvana," he rasped, his hand moving to the small of my back, pulling me flush against the edge of the drafting table. "I have spent every waking hour trying to remain your professor. I have lectured about foundations, while mine were crumbling every time you smiled." He leaned down, his lips brushing against the sensitive skin of my neck. "There is no more tutoring tonight. There is only this." He lifted me onto the table, sweeping the blueprints to the floor in one violent, impatient motion. The paper fluttered like dying birds, forgotten, as his mouth finally found mine. It wasn't a classroom critique, it was a reclamation. His touch was a lesson in everything the textbooks left out: heat, friction, and the beautiful, chaotic collapse of every wall he had ever built. The morning after the penthouse felt like a new world, but the university's stone walls were built to harbor old secrets. I walked into the architecture wing, my skin still humming from the memory of Minho's touch, only to find the air thick with a different kind of tension. People were whispering, their eyes darting toward me before snapping away. In the center of the student lounge, a digital screen displayed the department's anonymous forum. My heart stopped. It was a grainy, long-lens photo taken through the library windows from the night of the storm. Min-ho and I, silhouetted in the alcove, his blazer draped over my shoulders and his forehead pressed to mine. The caption was a poison-tipped arrow. Grades aren't the only thing being negotiated in the archives. Nirvana. I turned to see Assistant Professor Choi, a man who had long coveted Min-ho's chair. He was wearing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. The dean is waiting in his office. It seems there's a concern regarding professional boundaries and your recent jump in project scores. Panic, cold and sharp, flooded my veins. Not for my degree, but for Min-ho. A scandal like this wouldn't just stall his career, it would incinerate his legacy. I found him in the hallway outside the dean's office, flanked by 2 board members. He looked every bit the Ice King again. Immaculate suit, jaw set like granite, eyes shielded. As I approached, his gaze broke for a split second. In that flicker, I saw a raw, agonizing protectiveness. He stepped forward, putting himself between me and the whispering crowd. "Don't say a word," he murmured, his voice a low vibration meant only for me. "Min-ho, they have photos," I whispered, my voice trembling. "They think I'm using you. They'll ruin you." "Let them try," he said, and for the first time, his arrogance didn't feel like a mask. It felt like a shield. He turned to face the dean, his stature dwarfing the men around him. "If you are looking for someone to blame for a lapse in judgment, look at me. Nirvana is the most brilliant student this department has seen in a generation. Her work stands on its own. Any implication otherwise is a defamation of her talent, and I will resign before I let you touch her transcript." The hallway went silent. He was throwing away a decade of work to keep my future intact. He wasn't just my professor anymore. He was the man willing to burn his own monument to the ground to keep me in the light. Jeju Island was a lush, volcanic paradise, a world away from the suffocating whispers of the Seoul campus. We were there for the International Urban Design Summit, ostensibly as colleagues under the cover of a cooling investigation. But the air between us was thick with a new, dangerous electricity. The gala was held in a glass pavilion, perched over the black cliffs of the coast. Min-ho looked lethal in a tuxedo, a dark god among mortals. But for the first time, his attention was being fought for by the elite of the architectural world. And for the first time, he had to watch the world look at me. I wore a dress of emerald silk that clung to every curve, my hair a crown of curls that seemed to catch every spotlight in the room. I was no longer the defiant student in a messy studio. I was a woman who belonged in this room. Throughout the night, a prominent young developer from Singapore shadowed me, his hand lingering a second too long on the small of my back, as he laughed at my critique of his latest project. From across the room, I felt Min-ho's gaze. It wasn't the cold observation of a professor. It was the predatory focus of a man, watching someone touch his most prized possession. He didn't make a scene. He simply appeared. One moment I was debating glass tensile strength, and the next, Min-ho's hand was locked firmly around my waist, pulling me back against his chest. The heat of him was a silent claim. "Excuse us," Min-ho said, his voice a low, vibrating growl that made the developer blink in surprise. "Nirvana has a prior engagement." He led me out of the pavilion and into the humid night, his grip never loosening until we reached the sanctuary of his hotel suite. The moment the door clicked shut, he spun me around, pinning my wrists against the wood. The refined architect was gone. "You were preening under his touch," he rasped, his eyes dark with a possessive fever I had never seen. "Do you have any idea what it did to me? Watching him look at you like he could have a piece of what is mine." "I'm not a blueprint, Minho," I breathed, my heart thundering. "You can't just file me away." "No," he whispered, his mouth crashing down onto mine, desperate and hungry. "You're the masterpiece, and I don't share my work." The morning after the gala, the tropical sun of Jeju felt like a spotlight on a crime scene. I woke up to an empty bed and a heavy silence that felt far more permanent than the usual academic quiet. On the mahogany nightstand, a single thick envelope rested next to a cold cup of coffee. I opened it, expecting more blueprints, or perhaps a schedule for the day's final seminar. Instead, I found a formal letter of resignation addressed to the university board, signed in Minho's sharp, decisive script. Beneath it was a transfer of intellectual property rights, moving the credit for our joint heritage project, the design that would make his career legendary, entirely into my name. My heart didn't just sink, it plummeted. I found him on the balcony, staring out at the crashing waves of the East China Sea. He was dressed in a simple white shirt, the sleeves rolled up, looking stripped of the armor that had defined him for a decade. "What is this, Minho?" I asked, my voice cracking. "You're giving everything away. The board cleared the investigation because you told them it was a one-sided obsession. You lied to save me." "It wasn't a lie," he said, turning to look at me with an expression of heartbreaking serenity. "The obsession is mine. The talent, however, is yours. If I stay, the shadow of this scandal will follow you like a ghost. Every award you win, every building you raise, they will say you got there because of me. I won't let them do that to you." "I don't care what they say." I stepped toward him, clutching the papers. "I want the career with you. I don't want to build a world where you aren't the foundation." He reached out, his hand cupping my face with a tenderness that made the tears finally spill over. "You are the only masterpiece I ever truly cared about, Nirvana. I've spent my life building monuments to my ego, just like you said. It's time I built something that actually matters. Your future is that thing." "You're leaving," I whispered. "I'm stepping back so you can step forward," he corrected, his thumb brushing away a stray tear. "But don't think for a second that I'm letting you go. I'm just no longer your professor. From this moment on, I'm just a man who is hopelessly in love with the architect of his ruin." The grand opening of the new Seoul Cultural Center was a symphony of light, glass, and soaring steel. It was the most anticipated architectural debut of the decade, and the name etched into the silver plaque at the entrance was mine. Nirvana. I stood in the center of the atrium, surrounded by the world's elite, cameras flashing as critics marveled at the soul I had managed to breathe into the concrete. But I wasn't looking at the cameras. I was looking through the crowd for a single, familiar silhouette. I found him standing in the shadows of a cantilevered balcony, the very design he had once told me would never hold. Minho looked as lethal as ever in a tailored black suit, his silver-rimmed glasses catching the light. He wasn't the ice king of the university anymore. He was the head of a private consultancy, a man who worked only when and for whom he chose. And for the last year, his only focus had been me. He didn't approach me until the crowd began to thin. When he finally stepped into the light, the air in the room seemed to realign itself around him. He didn't offer a handshake. He simply reached out and tucked a stray curl behind my ear, his touch as possessive and electric as it had been on the night of the storm. "The structural load held," he murmured, his voice a low, private rumble that made my knees weak. "I told you it would buckle, but you were right. You built something that breathes." "I had a very demanding teacher," I teased, leaning into his space, the scent of his sandalwood cologne grounding me amidst the chaos of my success. "You haven't been a student for a long time, Nirvana," he rasped, his hand sliding down to rest firmly at the small of my back, drawing me flush against him. He didn't care who was watching. The scandal was a distant memory, replaced by a reality where we were equals. Now, you're the master, and I am simply the man who gets to go home with the genius. I looked up at him, seeing the pride and the raw, unyielding devotion in his obsidian eyes. We had moved past the blueprints and the secrets, past the classrooms and the sacrifices. "Is the foundation solid enough for you now?" I whispered. Minho leaned down, his lips brushing mine in a promise that was far more permanent than stone. "It's perfect," he breathed. "Let's go home and design something else."